Right. It is 4 minutes past one. I'm tempted to start. And mostly because, hi, I'm Tom Abbott. I'm Director of the Digital Cultures Research Centre, and I am presently in the atrium at Export, and it's really noisy. I'm in another presentation, so I'm going to duck out of this one. Two things to note. Well, three things to note. One, thank you for making the time. We have DCRCs sharing seminars 2 or 3 times a term. Amy and Nick do a hugely important job of organising them, and it will be my very great pleasure to introduce Amanda in a moment. Two housekeeping notes. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the DCRC YouTube afterward, and we'll have space for Q&A at the end. Amanda assures me that she's going to run to time. So any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll make sure we moderate them. As I say, I'm going to duck out because I'm going to listen to the recording afterward. But just to say thank you to Amanda for the talk you're about to hear. Amanda's going to introduce Fugitive Historiography, which is a title I wish I had, a framework developed through her moving image practice and research into archives, radicalized vision, and technological mediation. Amanda, I'm going to get quiet and hand over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, hopefully everyone can see. I'm going to try and run through this presentation, and hopefully there should be time for Q&As. Someone suggested words. And as always, a big thank you to the DCRC for inviting me to share this afternoon. So, before we get into what is kind of meant here by fugitive historiography, I want to say something about what we're going to experience in this hour. You're going to see some things from me that I've made, and you're going to hear from me. You're going to hear me thinking about what it is that I'm doing as I'm talking. My process is never closed. So what you're seeing today is another variation, another version. And that matters because fugitivity is about not being fixed. So in some ways, I'm hoping that the form of this talk performs the concept. So as you said, the process is never closed. I'm going to be thinking as I'm doing. So starting with what fugitive historiography is. It's a way of working with history that moves, blurs, escapes. It works through gaps, occlusions, and fragments. And it recognizes racialized archives and apparatus. And I'm very much interested in this concept of the overrepresentation of man. And this is a concept from Sylvia Wynter. But rather than overly define it here, what I wanted to do was perhaps show you an opening from a piece of work that I was working on last year called Occlusions. And this should hopefully explain some of what I mean by fugitive historiography. My first occlusion. I'm looking at this collection of films at the Library of Congress. The paper print collection. The earliest examples of American cinema. I'm looking for representations of blackness. I'm looking because I have this question about black innovation. in the history of the moving image. But before I can see and say, I need to stop, because the first piece that I can identify is this piece, in the catalogue, amongst the files, taken from a list from Horrocks Preserving Race Films. I see this Dancing Darky Boy, 1897. Now I already know by this title that I will be confronted by something problematic. I feel I need to protect this dancing child, because I have to think about whether they chose to be subject of this film and an object of this archive. Anna B. Scott suggests that this little darky on the dock taps and taps, sending out code, hoping that someone will answer them back, let him know he is safe. I am protected because of the racism that he faces, and the racism on display. And I cannot collude with this. I know this as I stand here, a black woman looking at this child in front of a mostly white audience. My first concern is that I can't be part of the problem of putting this child on display. For what purpose? So I invoke an ethics of care after Hartman. And how can I constitute that in a place at this time? Firstly, I invoke a history of experimental and expanded cinema. I invoke this projection and my body to consider this technology of film, the agency of this child and my identifications. So what you've just seen is a print film known as Dancing Darky Boy. Already we understand a lot from the title alone, the racialized violence embedded in the early apparatus of cinema. In Occlusions, I'm listening to the gap between what is archived and what is harmed, between visibility and violence, between what cinema showed and what it made possible to see. I use my own body to occlude the boy's body, not to erase him, but to intervene in the archive's gaze, to interrupt the apparatus that treated him as material. I want you to see two things in that moment. A black filmmaker working through an inheritance, my background in structural materialist filmmaking and of the Black British Film Workshop movement, and the archive itself as a racial apparatus, a technology that used blackness to define what cinema was. This is the ground of fugitive historiography. So how do I work? Because the method is part of the meaning. My practice is concerned with the image. It follows a tradition, as I said, of structuralist filmmaking, and it's formed by the Black Workshop movement in the UK. I move between moving image and interactive work. I'm a tinkerer. I break things apart. I rebuild them, test ideas through making. I am participatory and collaborative, sometimes with participants, sometimes with communities, and sometimes with myself. My work is political and poetic. I'm always looking for an emotional connection. And as I said, my process is never closed. And what do I mean by that? That means there's always variations and versions. The work changes with each audience. The temporal context shifts its meaning. I don't have to be one thing, the work doesn't have to resolve. Blur, that instability, is part of my. This is what Patricia Collins calls the outsider within. To be fugitive is to remain in motion and to refuse the single thread. So where did Occlusions come from? It sits within a larger project called Where Do You Keep Your Black People? This began with a concern with racial bias and injustice in II. I was thinking about Laura Mulvey's reading of the film Imitations of Life and what she sees and what she doesn't see. AI doesn't ask about Black life. AI uses race to define the system. It's the same logic early cinema used. This takes us directly from Winter's critique of the overrepresentation of man to Timnit Gebru's argument that the humanities have been dealing with this issue for decades, while AI stumbles through it clumsily. As I worked deeper into the archives, I confronted violence, trauma, and ethical problems of showing images that harm. I needed a method of care, of refusal, and of ethical handling. So occlusions became necessary, a way to work with racialized vision and computational vision while drawing on Black aesthetic strategies of opacity. It also let me go back to early cinematographic apparatus to rest and revisit how vision itself is shaped. My prior work also shaped this. Before, there was Where Were You in 1992? This was a collaborative participatory work trying to understand racism, nationalism, fascism, anti-racist and anti-fascist organizing, anti-war activism, and across global contexts. We needed in that a method that wasn't linear. So I returned to something called Nemism. The Nemism panels were an inheritance from the art historian Abby Warburg. But I was using moving image panels to think across time and place. The method allowed us to see themes, differences, affinities, fleeting moments, to see flight, movement, and blur. In its very earliest version, Nemism was a way for me to articulate how I understood my inheritance of structural materialist filmmaking, of Black filmmakers in the workshop movement, utilizing Abby Warburg's Nemism atlas, the way of compiling images together to think about where artists got their images to make meaning from, to read across different images to see how they articulated from the past, the present, forms of similarity and difference. Here in 2016, in one panel, I'm looking at the work of Annabelle Nicholson, and I'm thinking through the different approaches, aesthetics used in the 70s workshop film movement and in the 80s. It coalesced in trying to think about what was specific to Nicholson's work across different types of presentations that were being different types of presentations and aesthetics that were being developed at the time. Thinking through how you could use the medium both as a poetic medium, as a medium for resistance, but also very much focused on what the technology and the apparatus was doing itself. And Where Were You in 1992? This became a method that was useful to draw in to think about activism across the globe in the 90s. We were focused in 92 at the start at looking at the anti-racist movement in the UK in the 90s, the context of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, but also looking at the context where my collaborator Rasko Novakovic had been, his work had also been centered on the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia and the anti-war movement that was there, and the overlaps of global resistance that occurred there, here, there, and now. And so the panels worked very well as a way of bringing together lots of different images, lots of different content, and again, thinking about their similarities, their differences.
We're not going to sit at home and just like couch potatoes and just watch. We have to.
In this panel, we had, I'll show that again.
Maybe you can go and show a little bit.
In this panel, we have the kind of elements or footage from the uprisings in LA in '92, local demonstrations in the 2000s of anti-racist protests on the streets of London in the 90s, marches against the BNP headquarters. We have an excerpt from Malcolm X, the film by Spike Lee. And what we're looking at is the ways in which, in this particular panel, we were able to choose a theme of marching to think about how that was looking across the globe. How could we organize all of this material thinking about what resistances looked like, how they were similar, how they had an element of the everyday. And so Nemesis as a method, in its various approaches that I'd utilized it, allowed one to look across time, to work with echoes and variations, to break the expectation of narrative, to create constellations rather than single stories. You could interact, you could stop and pause, you could expand, you could look through the material in a way that brought these different resistances together. And this method traveled across into the works for imitations and occlusions, which I'll go on to further. But to put this into context, the theoretical grounding for this type of work, what I would say situates my intellectual companions, include Winter, Moten, Hartman, Hill Collins, Amaro, Sean Sobis from here at UE Bristol, and Mill Iland. These works shaped mine, and mine converses with theirs. We can think of Winter, who gives us the critique of the overrepresentation man. She asks who counts as human, and and in that sense, how do archives organize themselves around that definition? Her critique helps me to see the archive as a technology of exclusion. Moten gives me counterpoint, multiple lines, no resolutions, blur as a refusal of boundary, fugitivity, a desire for the outside. This is how I edit, how I assemble images, how I think about the flicker and the stutter of recognition. And, of course, the lineage of the undercommons is part of this. I think to Hartman. Hartman gives me critical fabulation, impossible archives, ethical imagination, care and refusal. She allows us to let imagination enter the archive without betraying the people within it. And Hill Collins offers Black feminist epistemology, relational knowledge, care as a method, the outsider within. This shapes my participatory and collaborative approach. Participants in communities are experts in the process. And then to Amaro, who helps me think about the Black technical object, about data sets as racialized structures of miscalculation, misclassification, and Blackness as computational noise. And this directly affects an influence for the film Imitations, which I'll show a little clip of in a bit. And of course, there's Sean Sobers and small anthropology. And Sobers' small anthropology grounds me in a method of everyday life. He reminds us that historical insight comes from the mundane, the ordinary, the lived. This aligns with my autoethnographic and embodied approach. And there is Island, who writes about Black performance as a rupture of historiography. This again echoes the way my films and installations perform history aesthetically, materially, and fugitively. So here I want to show an extract from the film Imitations. Imitations of Life is a film by Douglas Sirk. It's an adaptation of the book by Fanny Hurst, also called Imitations of Life. And it looks to, it's a story of a black and a white woman who joined forces. The black woman becomes the housekeeper for the white woman because their children are the same age. And as the white woman goes off and has a star-spangled career and success, their daughters, one who has a mixed race heritage, is trying to escape her history. And it's a story of passing for being white, but it's also a story of how these two women in the 50s in America are able to exist as women, at some points comrades, and at other points the lesser story of the black woman is not recognized. This is a film that has also been critiqued by Laura Mulvey for the way in which black people are represented. So I used delayed cinema in this film to revisit some of those questions. But I'll give you a little bit of this reworking of the film that I made in 22.
That old ocean, but it seems to me I didn't hear the thank you for those hot dogs. I'm hungry, thank you.
Susie! Pardon me.
Right where?
Right down there under the view. Come, children. You hear me, Sarah Jane?
Of the world, Lord, trouble of the world, trouble, Lord, of the world, out sooner will be done. Trouble, Lord, of the world, I'm going home to live with God. No more weeping and wailing, no more weeping and wailing, no more weeping and wailing. I'm going home to live with my Lord. Lord, sooner will be done. My trouble of this world, oh, my trouble in this world, Lord, my trouble in this world, Lord, how sooner will be done. To trouble of this world, I'm going home. To live
will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is the shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall...
So thinking through what I was doing with this film, I was thinking about AI, I was thinking about data sets, I was thinking about anaglyphs and early cinematic and pre-cinematic technologies. I was listening for, what was I looking for, what was in the gap? The Mulvey problem, delayed cinema, I utilised to consider what she had seen as a problem of only being able to use digital technologies to finally see all these black extras, the black images, the black representation of life in the background. But my situated gaze already saw these. And so it built up a critique of privileged gaze, of intersectional listening, of looking, and questioning the authority of classification. Mulvey needs delayed cinema to see black extras on the boardwalk, but those figures were already visible to me. My situated gaze, not hers. In the first clip of Imitations of Life that you see, the lead character walks down the boardwalk steps, and just as her picture is taken, just as she's gazing out looking for her lost child, who's beneath the boardwalk. We then see this other black woman walk down the boardwalk. The photographer is there, but just before he takes her picture, he knocks her out of the main white character knocks the camera from his hand, and that picture can't be taken. But there's a third variation where the lead black female character walks down the steps and her picture is not even conceived of being possibly taken. And in this sense, it works as a way of thinking through black representation and the questions of intersectionality. And I wanted to think about these things with all of those images that we saw. I wanted to build a data set of ecology. I wanted to think about how differently I might ask those questions around what is it that AI is looking for? How could we perhaps think about racial justice rather than injustice in relation to artificial intelligence? So I built my own data set. I used the film as data, looking at what types of images my circ had been looking at in order to produce the mise en scène that he did. I looked at civil rights images, acts of solidarity and protest. The algorithm that I then trained the set on strained to see what I saw. It flickered, it hesitated, it blurred. But this flicker is meaningful. It reveals the instability of machine perception and the limitations of categorical thinking. Noise becomes a site of knowledge. So what is fugitive historiography? It's a refusal of closure, a practice of blur, movement, and contradiction, working with and through gaps, listening between silences, relational, participatory, embodied, allowing the image to escape fixed meaning, ethical occlusion, a method of staying outside of the representation of man. This work builds on a line of fugitive thinkers of Hartman, Moten, Ireland, Sobers, and extends into moving image, interactive media, tinkering, computational critique, image ecologies, and archival care. Mine is a variation with a long fugitive tradition. And the key concepts I'm thinking of are gaps as generative, occlusion as care, blur as method, blur as refusal, flight as structure, and histories in motion. So fugitive historiography is my method for staying in motion when the archive wants to hold me still and let me kind of encircle that in another way by saying, thinking of that first film, it is the boy, my body, the gap. It is the blur. We return not to resolve, but to keep listening. So I invite you again to think about that first clip of looking at this boy who's seemingly a victim of the archive. But can we find the gap? Can we find the blur? Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Just let the applause drift across the screen there. So we've got a little bit of time now for questions from anybody who may have them. There was a lot to think about there. I'm sure that there are a fair few people who do have questions. Amy, do they need to go in the chat, or can people just raise their hands?
No, people can.
We've just sort of arranged it so that you can jump in with a question, right? Great. Charlotte, why don't you begin?
Hello, thank you. It's so lovely to listen to you talk, Amanda. I was curious about your tinkering, and I wanted to have a sense of your physical setup when you are working on these things and what tinkering means for you. I'm really interested in that as a kind of a political strategy, and what that means for you in a practical way.
Thank you, Charlotte. So one of the slides I didn't include was probably a slide of one of my setups. So I work very much with different tools, like Touch Designer is a tool that I've used. Which is a kind of live, interactive kind of platform, because I wanted to. It's very easy when working with films that already exist to use the kind of traditional technology, such as, Premiere or something for Avid, to edit. And I wanted to unpack what it was while I was editing, because thinking about the technology that you're utilizing also, encapsulates all what we're talking about, kind of the racialized aspect of cinema, the questions of bias that are within the technology themselves, and how do we work our way through answering or thinking about those questions without also thinking about the technology. So I wanted a system in which I could look at images while thinking about why I was placing one image next to another. And so I kind of build these little networks of different ways of thinking about how I'm editing one image next to another. Can I use a slider as opposed to a cut? Are there different ways in which I can involve my body in the performative aspect? And, something like Touch Design is really great because it's like a VJing software. So you can kind of mix in any which way as you're working with the image, so that when I'm thinking about what I'm doing, my body is responding. And I tend to also then show the data set has become a flip book, thinking again about how I can relate one image to another. How does my body then relate in that conversation about images? And then, I'll go back to thinking about the instruments of vision and how I can break apart those or listen differently or see differently. So some of the work you would have seen is I've got an anaglyph. So I worked with this idea of putting on 3D glasses to see the image, which brought black figures to the forefront in a film in which Mulvey's saying they're in the back. And so that act of putting on the glasses to see means that you're engaged in that kind of process of thinking bodily through how images are making meaning. And so there's a constant working with the apparatus of vision, of utilizing that as a way to think through things. I think that helps.
That's just amazing. I have to apologise because I've got to go to the Arnolfini to teach now, but so I'm going to miss the rest of the questions. But I really, really enjoyed hearing you speak, and it's very profound, and I want to share it with a particular colleague. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Cheerio.
Mandy.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Actually, it was really moving and beautiful presentation, just so clearly articulated your critical position. So there are various things that I'm curious about, but I was thinking particularly about that wonderful piece, the wonderful piece based on the Library of Congress, Occlusions, and thinking about how you, and if you do, directly engage with the archives, whether that piece, for example, has some kind of life in a dialogue with the Library of Congress. So I'm just kind of curious I'm curious in a sense about the audiences for your work and perhaps the archive as a particular audience.
It's an interesting question. I think so. Occlusions, like imitations, were shown, for example, at the iFilm conference in Amsterdam. So that's what the kind of big film archive there. The film is a longer piece and looks at all of Occlusions, looks at all of the pieces that can be found in the paper print collection that have a racial character towards them, as well as kind of looking at almost anything that's digitally available from that paper print collection. It's a collection I've worked with for a very long time. And I think that's one part of the work of archives that I have with archives is kind of the reinterpretation of archives and seeing how one can work with it. And, I've spoken to people who've been in the Library of Congress and worked with that material and how difficult it can be. But there's also kind of repositioning what an archive means. So this idea of a kind of lived experience. And so when people are watching it, there's a different set of conversations, I think. And that shifting notion about what an archive is really important to my work. There's a number of different ways of working with the archive in that sense. I'm working on some new stuff with the Bill Douglas Museum, looking at stereographs. So there's as much as possible, there's a kind of a hands-on, there's a reinterpretation. I don't know if that completely answered your question, Andy.
Yeah, it's because it's about whether what you then do informs how the Library of Congress works with that material in the future. I guess that's what I was kind of getting at too.
I think my work with the Museum speaks to different contexts in which, museums can, we can speak very differently about approaches to what archives and collections are. So I think I go between interpreting on the one hand, being in a space where we can really go kind of past decolonial or post-colonial notions of the archive.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a really thought-provoking presentation.
Rima, hi.
Hi there. Thanks, Amanda. That was really beautiful. My question kind of speaks to you talking about the work of the Museum. So, but also the kind of effort and the energy that comes with decolonizing archives. And I wondered, to go back to your original quest that you went to the archive looking for blackness. And I'm really curious about that blackness, what that blackness was for you that you were looking for, because there's a thing about going looking for something in an archive, and what you get is what you got, you know. So I'm curious about the connection between what you were originally looking for and your work with the Unmuseum, and whether there's a kind of relationship there. If you could say more about that.
Thanks, Rima, and I should tip my hat to you in a particular way, because both you and Sean are my supervisors for my DPhil, and so a lot of this work is grounded in the care that you have given and your knowledge and experience to me while I'm going through this process. I would say I was starting off the project, where do you see your Black people? So many titles of a question. Where do you keep your Black people, I should say? That started off as a critique of artificial intelligence around what types of questions were asked. And occasions fed into, at the same time, a lot of work that I've historically done with kind of different types of archives. And I'm really interested in Black innovation and Black making and Black creativity, and where we can see it, where it doesn't sit seemingly in this wider context. So my DPhil very much deals with, as a Black filmmaker, what's my inheritance growing up in the UK? And you're thinking about, it cannot be at this point in time, when we say the first feature film was like in the 70s. And there are other ways in which we understand culture and heritage. So I wanted to go back to something like the paper print collection that I knew very well, that stands really importantly for conversations around what the history of film is. The whole conversation around film started to change again when the paper print collection was turned into first 16 mil and then kind of 35 mil and now digitized. That really changed what was understood by where film was coming from. Yet it didn't unpack those conversations of what Black innovation must have been. But we can't keep asking the same questions in that kind of canonistic approach, which is, who are the grand masters? Because then all we get is D.W. Griffith and more racism. So I think there's a set of conversations within this where I was trying to listen and see a completely different approach to where culture is experienced. And for Black life, it's not categorized in the same way. It's categorized by not just resistance, but different way of being. And therefore we need different approaches to archiving, to transmitting that knowledge and that understanding. And the Unmuseum is a project that says we don't have to start from the same basis, particularly of the modern museum, that was there to instruct and to educate in Western notions. There are many different ways in which we can exist. Again, coming back to kind of Sylvia Wynter's notion of the overrepresentation of man, there is not just one. There's not one category. So I think very much I was really interested in and continue to want to work within an environment where we think very differently and about different ways of being. Okay. Nick, you're being chair here. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say thanks. So we've got 3 more questions already lined up. So that's great. We have more time, so we'll use it. Stephen, hi.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Amanda. Amazing talk. Every time I hear you speak about your work, I'm always excited. I want to ask a kind of back to your tacit understanding and your response, because a question that comes up for me a lot, which I don't know the answer for. And I think you've hinted at different frameworks for this. When you go looking for the body, the representational body that you're seeking, and when you're surprised. And I'm just wondering for you, the different maybe registers that you respond to and how you frame that in terms of where the work leads. So it's a very kind of instinctive response maybe initially. And I know, again, I've been lucky enough to get to Library of Congress, and when I find things, I tended to have to go for a walk for like an hour and come around to understand what I've just seen. because it wasn't necessarily what I was looking for, but it's taken me by surprise or taken me aback. And I'm just wondering about that different register from knowing what you're looking for and seeking it and finding it and then mediating it and working with it. And then the difference when you actually, like maybe with the paper collection, you're literally meeting something you haven't seen or didn't expect.
I think there are a number of different frameworks and different approaches, and I think they're not trying to settle is one of them. I think I'm thinking about different approaches to fugitivity expresses a lot of how I work, because I've gone through lots of different approaches. You know, my approach is, as you said, starting it in kind of structure with my practice, a kind of avant-garde, experimental, mostly English film practice, and then at the same time saying, well, where that there are problems in that, I don't quite fit, or some of the stories I'm hearing don't quite fit, and so you start another round, and I was very interested in this tinkering notion of technology. So, you know, I could look at media archaeology and the importance of media archaeology for thinking about different variants of the technology and where they come from. But, you know, when I think about media archaeology, the problem with that is it's extremely non-political. It doesn't really understand the questions of power, of the racialized aspects of those technologies. And so trying to find ways in which that speaks to what it is that I'm doing or other work that I've seen is really me also taking the autoethnographic route. It's also going, what's my everyday? It's what I you know, again, get from Sean Sobers, you know, that this kind of, how do I walk? How am I being in my everyday? You know, and you know, Sean's last book, thinking about going from room to room. How do we exist with things? Not as an abstraction, but a reality. So Occlusions, you know, is a film where I say, I'm standing in front of you, mostly a white audience, because for the majority of time, when I show that type of work, it will be to a white audience. Now, it's a live performative, mostly. It's a recorded version of it, but it's a live performed piece. That can change depending on context. And that, again, is a performance inheritance about what the document is. So all of these things weave together because they also weave through me. And I can't discount my positionality, my history, the things that are important to me within that. So I think those are the things that come to mind. They come to mind in terms of also, you know, I am this person speaking to these things, seeing it at this moment in time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Anne, you're up.
Beautifully haunting presentation. Mine's less of a question, but more, I would just like to acknowledge the fact that you've sparked curiosity in me from this talk. And the bit that I'm quite curious about, which potentially we could work on together later, is, so it's not a question really, is you talk about situated, like you watch things, like you were just saying before, it's how your body interprets what you're seeing, sort of thing. It's that kind of thing. And the bit that's intrigued me is I'm like, I would like to find out more how different people, not just Black people, but different people from different ages, generations, and different backgrounds actually view and perceive things as well. Because I was a bit like, I got what you were saying. I have the same sort of visceral reaction as well. But I kind of wondered how other people would react and what they would see. And I think that would also support your work as well. So just a little call out for a little chat and a coffee in the future. Thank you for a beautiful presentation.
Thanks, Anne. And I think I'm really into situated intersectionality, which is kind of Yuval Davis's work. So I, you know, thinking about ways in which that exact same thing, that I'm speaking from this place, a certain type of privilege, as well as dealing with you know, a racialized context, and acknowledging that becomes really important. I think we were really concerned about that in the Where Were You 1992 project, because we couldn't immediately say the Black experience in in the 90s in the UK was the same as in France. And we were trying to collide these experiences together and these images together. And it didn't have to be the same, but one had to acknowledge the different history of anti-racism in the UK as opposed to that in France, for example. And that became why things like this, the idea of counterpoint becomes really important. The idea that you can have multiple approaches to things and multiple, and that they don't always have to weave together into a perfect harmony. Thanks, Jen. We could always have coffee, yeah.
So I think we've got time for two more questions, and how convenient that we have two more questions. So Patricia.
Thank you. That was really wonderful, Amanda, and really quite provoking, I thought. And I suppose I don't know if it's a question, I'm still formulating, but just try, and I know we've sort of had these conversations. And for me, it really is about the role of the archive and to what extent, I mean, in my work, I stopped using archive because it was a tool I felt that continues to refine and define groups and to racialize people. And I suppose to some extent, what you're doing is challenging and trying to break that down. But I just wonder if the mere fact that the archive almost acts as this starting point then maintains its position. And I don't know if you watched Newsnight last night, but there was a Labour MP, I didn't get her name, and Paddy O'Connell was desperately trying to get her to engage with this whole thing around Rachel Reeves, and she refused to do that. And I just wonder, to your extent, how is there a love-hate relationship with archive? Because by using it, you're then able to make your points. But the fact is, it's there. Yeah, it was just that, if that was something that you'd, sort of tussled with.
Yes, very much so. But I think again, referring back to some of the work of the Art Museum and this conversation of fugitivity, and Winter's expression of overrepresentation, there are different questions, there are different concerns. When I was looking at the question of AI, that always, one of the biggest concerns for me was whose questions were these, whose categories, and so I can look at certain work at a certain point in time and go, that is of interest, and I'm looking for certain things. Within that, I have to consider, I'm not just looking, how am I looking? What's the care and consideration, the ethical moment of seeing, of being? And then there are different ways of being entirely, but don't fit that model and don't have to. And I think that's the question of what I love about Moten's work, that kind of refusal to be seen as a single being, right? This limit, to limit us to categories that came about at a certain moment in time, which have a power dynamic, don't speak to how I exist. They don't speak to the lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so archives can form their part, but it's not the only way we transmit knowledge. There's a long history of indigenous cultures, of alternative approaches, of activist approaches to archives that show how we transmit knowledge, what we keep, sits in a completely different space to those big monuments of capitalism and of Western tradition. And so I think that is part of the toolkit, the frameworks that we can utilize. And mine in particular is one in which I talk about, escaping in the margins. Right? That's where my innovation, my creativity sparks. That's what I'm interested in. And that's my particular way of thinking about certain things, or the ways in which I might behave at certain times. And I think it has as much weighting and standing as another.
So we've got one final question, Lena. If you'd like to ask that, that's great.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm still a bit mind blown, so hard to string a sentence together. I was really interested in kind of hearing you unpack the kind of concept of fugitive technical image, and obviously your interest in lineage. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more, and you've partially sort of put forward really interesting ideas around this lineage of technical image and kind of how, Flusser's or Farodsky's or Parika's kind of conceptualization doesn't, it's very apolitical. And I was wondering if there is anything else that kind of you'd like to say, and maybe writing that you will be doing around this kind of different conceptualization of, fugitive technical image in the context of archive and AI, and kind of thinking around justice and AI, situated justice and AI. Yeah, just very open question, but thank you so much for the talk today. It was incredible.
Thank you. I think there's a paper that's due out at some point, which is based on limitations, which is around AI, and builds on a little differently from Ramon Amaro's work around the Black technical object. And I think it's really, what's really interesting about going back to cinema is that we could, there's a wonderful book, Cinema of Racialized Attractions, which speaks to, a different way of looking at film history, an important way of understanding film history, that film becomes film, substantiates itself as that medium through using race. And that's really important, because part of the conversations around AI is to substantiate AI by using race to talk about categorization. And those questions are problematic if we don't critique them and then think about other ways in which, and other types of questions that we can utilize. And so when I was looking at imitations, it was trying to go past the notion of just auditing data sets to say, oh, we could do better in categorizing, and saying there is a different way of being and a different way of technologically utilizing apparatus or working with apparatus. And so I've got a number of different elements. On imitations, the filmic data is really interesting, because we've dealt with some of those questions in the arts and humanities previously about how we can elide categories, how we can substantiate meaning even in one image that represents more than its sum, right? So that we have that history. But I also think thinking about how different apparatus do that. There's a history of lots of Black filmmakers, of artists who are going back to early technology, like myself, and reutilizing it. So we have these modes in which we can think about racialized vision differently. And so there's all these different types of approaches that are in opposition to, fleetingly fly away from the kind of central notion of there's only one way of knowing and of being. And so I'm interested in those. So there is a number of different elements where that's coming out. My DPhil is on filmic history in my context of Black filmmaking in the UK. Imitations, film on data is coming back hopefully in a year or so, but that's work I've started to write on around AI. And there are other different bits and pieces. I should write more, basically.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you all so much. And I just wanted to say, if everybody can thank Amanda for that. That really, just like to echo all the comments that have been made. That really was a beautiful presentation. And thanks for making a really beautiful, kind of enthralling and lasting moment today. That was special. So thanks everybody for coming along. And I hope to see you all next week. Same time on the 9th. I believe that's right, Amy, correct? For our next seminar with Julia Scott Stevenson, who will be talking about climate justice and immersive and interactive documentary.
Thank you, DCRC.